They said success would heal everything. But they never told me it could feel this empty. I sit behind a glass desk, 30 floors above the bay. The sun sliding over the water like liquid metal. My name is Liam Carter, 32. Founder of Carter & Co. Design Group. One of the fastest growing green architecture firms in San Francisco. The papers spread across my desk show projects worth millions. Every surface gleams. Every corner screams control. And yet, I can't shake the hollow space in my chest that hums louder than the city outside. It's late afternoon. The kind that turns the glass walls gold. My assistant, Jordan, knocks and pokes his head in. Boss, you should head out soon. Big weekend coming up. Right, he says, with a grin that feels borrowed from someone younger. Lighter. I nod, without looking up. Yeah, something like that. When he leaves, the silence folds back around me. I flip the top folder just to do something. But the letters blur. A notification flashes on my phone, one new voicemail from Oliver Brooks. The name makes my pulse jump. Oliver has been my grandmother's lawyer for as long as I can remember. I hit play. Liam. His calm voice says, I'm sorry to inform you that Margaret passed early this morning. She left you a letter. It's important you come to Salem as soon as you can. I stop breathing. The sound of the bay disappears. For a second, the whole world narrows to that sentence. She's gone. I press my fingers against my temples. The hum of the city returns in slow waves. My grandmother, the only person who stayed when everyone else walked away. My throat tightens before I even realize tears are forming. I look at the calendar on my desk. Filled with meetings. Deadlines. Investor calls. None of it matters now. I grab my jacket and keys, ignoring the ping of new emails. The elevator ride down feels endless. In the mirrored walls, I look like someone else. Expensive suit. Sharp jawline. But the boy behind those eyes hasn't grown much past 7. The one who waited by a window that summer day, asking where his parents went. Outside. The air smells of salt and car exhaust. I drive aimlessly at first, just letting the highway swallow me. The voice in my head keeps repeating the same thing. She's gone. And she took my only home with her. 3 hours later, I pull into Salem, Oregon. The sky is low, heavy with spring rain. The house stands at the end of a narrow road lined with overgrown trees. It looks smaller than I remember. The paint has faded. The porch steps creak. But it's still the same place where I learned to build birdhouses and fix a leaky roof. Oliver's car is parked outside. He's waiting by the door. Gray suit. Briefcase tucked under one arm. Liam, he says, his voice softer than usual. I didn't want to tell you over the phone. But she went peacefully. In her sleep. I nod. Unable to speak. Inside. The air carries the faint scent of pine wood and old books. Nothing's changed the quilt on the couch. The stack of crossword puzzles. The photos on the mantel. My grandmother smiling. Her hand on my shoulder at my college graduation. Oliver sets a small wooden box on the kitchen table. She asked me to give this to you personally. There's a sealed envelope inside. Her words were, and I quote, "He'll know when he's ready. I have decided." He stays a few minutes longer, explaining funeral arrangements. Legal details I barely register. When he leaves, I sit at the table staring at the box. My hands tremble when I reach for it. But I stop short of opening it. Rain begins to fall, tapping against the windows. I can almost hear her voice in the rhythm of it. Patience. Liam. Some truths need the right time. I stand, pacing the small kitchen. My chest feels too tight. I should open it. I should read what she wanted me to know. But fear pins me in place. What if it changes everything I thought I knew about her, or about them? The old clock above the stove ticks loudly. I pour a glass of water. Take one sip. And set it down untouched. My reflection in the window looks like a stranger trapped between two lives, the man who built something out of nothing, and the child who still doesn't understand why love can vanish overnight. I walk down the hallway toward her room. The door is half open. The bed is neatly made, the air faintly scented with lavender. On her nightstand sits the small lamp she always left on when I stayed over as a boy. Next to it, a framed photo of me at age 8, holding a wooden house we built together. The handwriting at the bottom says, "For Liam, who learns faster than the world expects." My chest aches. I sit on the edge of the bed, running a hand over the quilt. The silence presses in. "Why did you wait?" "Grandma," I whisper. "Why didn't you tell me when you were still here?" There's no answer. Only the steady hum of rain and the ticking clock down the hall. Later. I step outside, the cool air cutting through my suit. The trees sway in the wind, and for the first time in years, I feel small again. I look back at the house, its windows glowing softly in the dusk. Somewhere inside that wooden box sits the truth about my life. I reach into my pocket, feeling the weight of my car keys, then let them drop back in. I'm not ready to leave. Not yet. The night deepens, and the sound of the rain blends with the whisper of the river behind the house. I stand there, motionless, watching the light fade from the sky, knowing that when I finally open that letter, nothing will ever be the same again. The next morning, I wake up before dawn, the gray light barely touching the curtains. For a moment, I forget where I am. Then the smell of old pine and rain brings me back. The house feels too quiet, as if it's holding its breath. I sit up, my clothes still folded over the chair from the night before. The wooden box waits on the kitchen table. I'm touched. I look at it but turn away. Not yet. Outside, mist hangs low over the yard. I grab my jacket and step onto the porch. The boards creaking under my weight. The air is cold enough to sting my throat. I walk toward the back of the house where the garden used to be. Grandma's old wind chime still hangs by the shed, its soft sound mixing with the rustle of wet leaves. For a second, I can almost see her there, kneeling among the tomatoes, her straw hat tilted back as she tells me to water slowly, not drown the roots. I close my eyes and suddenly I'm 7 again. That morning in Portland, the light looked the same. I remember the smell of pancakes, the faint hum of the radio. I had a toy truck in my hand when I realized the house was silent. No sound from the kitchen. No coffee brewing. No voices. Just stillness. I called out, expecting Mom's voice to answer from the other room. Nothing. I checked their bedroom. The bed was made. Too neat. On the dresser sat a folded note pinned under a magnet shaped like a heart. I could barely read all the words, but I knew enough to understand they were gone. At first I thought it was a joke. Maybe they were hiding, planning a surprise. I waited all day, sitting on the porch, my backpack still on my shoulders. The sun moved across the yard and I kept looking at the road, waiting for the car to pull in. When it got dark, I lit a candle the way Mom used to when the power went out. The candle burned low, and the shadows grew long. And I told myself they would walk through the door any minute. They never did. Days passed. I ran out of food and started drinking tap water to fill my stomach. The phone rang once, but I was too scared to answer. I didn't want anyone to know they were gone. If the police found out, they might take me away. So I acted normal. I went to school. I smiled. I told my teacher Mom was sick and Dad was working out of town. At night I came home to the same quiet house. I learned to sleep with the TV on, just to hear voices. By the 5th day, the fridge was empty. I walked to the corner store with the few coins I found in a jar and bought a loaf of bread. The man behind the counter looked at me strangely. He asked where my parents were. I told him they were busy. His eyes softened. But he didn't press. He gave me a candy bar for free. When I came back, I ate the bread slowly, piece by piece, afraid of running out again. The next morning I woke up to a knock at the door. It wasn't them. It was Margaret Carter, my grandmother. She was smaller than I remembered, her gray hair tied back, her face drawn from the long drive. She stepped inside without a word, her eyes scanning the empty kitchen. When she saw the note on the fridge, she picked it up and folded it into her coat pocket. Then she turned to me. "Come on, Liam," she said softly. "You're coming home with me." I didn't argue. I just nodded. She packed a small bag for me. Some clothes, my favorite book, and the toy truck. Before we left, I looked at the fridge one last time. The heart-shaped magnet still clung to the metal, holding nothing. Her house in Salem felt like another planet. It smelled like soap and cinnamon. There was an old clock that chimed every hour, and a cat named Whiskey who refused to come near me for weeks. The first night I slept in a real bed, under a quilt she said her mother had made. She sat at the edge of the bed and asked if I wanted her to read something. I shook my head. She turned off the light but left the door cracked open. I remember lying there, staring at the hallway light, wondering if Mom and Dad were staring at a different light somewhere else. Days turned into weeks. Grandma made sure I went to school, brushed my teeth, said, "Thank you." She was strict, but gentle. Every morning she'd say, "You can't change what people do, Liam, but you can decide who you'll be because of it." I didn't understand then, but those words stuck. One evening, she called me into the kitchen. A small cake sat on the table, candles flickering. "My 8th birthday," she sang softly, a little off-key. When the song ended, I stared at the candles. "Go on," she said. "Make a wish." I hesitated. I didn't want to tell her my wish was for my parents to come back. I just blew out the candles and smiled the way she needed me to. That night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her crying in the living room. I crept down the hall and peeked through the crack of the door. She was holding a picture of my father, the same one that now sits on her dresser. Her shoulders shook as she whispered something I couldn't hear. Years later, I realized that was the night she decided to keep the truth from me. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Maybe she was protecting him. The sound of wind brings me back to the present. I'm standing in her garden again, my shoes wet from the dew. The air tastes like memory. Behind me, the screen door squeaks open. "It's Oliver. I thought you might still be here," he says, stepping onto the porch. "There's coffee inside if you want it." "Thanks," I answer, my voice rough. He studies me for a moment. "She loved you. You know, more than anything. She never stopped talking about you." I nod, unable to look at him. "I know." He leaves me there, the screen door closing with a soft thud. I stay in the garden a long time, watching the light shift through the trees, somewhere inside the house. The clock chimes 9 times. I think of that boy waiting by the window, and the woman who saved him without asking for anything in return. When I finally head back inside, I pass the kitchen table. The wooden box sits where I left it, waiting. I brush my fingers over the lid but still don't open it. The truth can wait a little longer. The rain starts again. Gentle at first, then steady. I make a pot of coffee the way she used to. Strong and dark. The smell fills the room. For the first time in years, the house doesn't feel empty. It feels like it's watching me, waiting for what comes next. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the yard smelling of wet earth and pine. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat by the window. The clouds moved low and slow across the sky. The same kind of clouds I remembered from high school mornings. I used to watch them while waiting for the school bus at the end of the gravel road. Backpack dragging on the ground, wishing for a different life. Back then I didn't talk much. Kids in Salem could sense when something about you didn't fit. They knew my parents were gone. Even if I never said it out loud. I kept my head down, focused on grades, woodshop, and the quiet rhythm of work. Grandma used to tell me that effort was its own kind of prayer. She would leave handwritten notes on the kitchen table before school. Don't forget your lunch. Don't forget who you are. In my teens, I started helping her fix things around the house. The roof leaked every winter, so we learned to patch it together with tar and leftover shingles. On Saturdays, we went to the farmer's market. She'd buy peaches and talk with neighbors about things that never mattered much but made the world feel normal. She had a way of pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. One evening when I was 16, I came home to find her sitting on the porch with 2 cups of tea. She handed me one and said, "You know, you don't have to be angry forever." I told her I wasn't angry. She smiled, a little sad. "Of course you are. You just don't show it the same way other people do." That night, I stayed up late sketching. Drawing became my language. The one place I could turn frustration into something real. By the time I graduated high school, I had a folder full of designs for buildings I thought could change the way people lived. Small homes with light, air, and space for quiet. When the acceptance letter from the University of Oregon arrived, Grandma cried for the first time in years. College was the first time I felt free and terrified at once. I worked part-time at a construction site, saved every dollar, and sent some home. Grandma refused to cash my checks. She mailed them back with notes written in blue ink. "Keep this for your future. Mine has already been good enough." I visited her every few months. She'd always be waiting at the bus station with a paper bag of sandwiches and that same smile. We'd sit on the porch and talk until the sun dropped behind the trees. She loved to hear about the campus, the professors, the new world I was discovering. But sometimes she'd fall quiet, staring at me as if trying to memorize my face. In my last year, she got sick. Heart problems, the doctor said. But she hid it well. She refused to let me drop classes or come home. I still remember the call one afternoon in early spring. Her voice was calm, just a little dizzy spell. "Nothing to worry about. Finish what you started. Liam, that's what strong people do." After graduation, I found a job at a firm in San Francisco. It was small, but they believed in sustainable design. Something Grandma always said mattered. Within a few years, I started my own company. We built eco-friendly homes, spaces meant to feel alive. When the business took off, I bought her a new roof, a solar water heater. Even tried to convince her to move closer to me. She laughed and said, "The city's too noisy." My heart's country-born. Every success I had felt like paying back a debt I could never repay. But no matter how much I achieved, part of me stayed in that small house in Salem, hearing the clock chime at midnight and knowing she was just down the hall, still awake with her book and her tea. The last time I saw her alive was a winter evening 2 years ago. I had driven up from the city after a long week of meetings. She was thinner, her hands shaking when she poured the tea, but her eyes still sharp. We sat by the fire, and she said, "You've done well, Liam, but you're still chasing ghosts." I looked at her, not sure what she meant. She smiled. "I hope one day you'll let the past rest. When I left the next morning, she hugged me longer than usual. As I walked to my car, she called after me. There are things I should have told you, but you're not ready yet. Someday. I told her I'd come back soon. She nodded, though I think we both knew that might not happen. Now, sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the faint smell of her perfume and the ticking of that same old clock, those words echo louder than ever. She had been preparing me for something. The box on the table isn't just a keepsake. It's her final lesson. The door creaks behind me. I turn to see Oliver standing there again, hat in hand. He must have stopped by after finishing with the funeral home. You're still here, he says gently. I nod. I can't seem to leave. He hesitates before speaking. She worried about you more than she let on. Said you carry silence like armor. I manage a small smile. She was right. He steps closer, his eyes soft. There's more to her estate than what's in that box. When you're ready, I'll walk you through the paperwork. She made specific requests. Said she wanted things done properly. By her terms. I'll call you tomorrow. I tell him. He nods. Leaves quietly. The screen door closes with a sigh. Evening settles in again. The golden light turning the walls amber. I light a small lamp, the one she used to keep by her reading chair. The room feels alive again. I take out a notebook from my bag and flip through sketches from years ago. Designs for a home built from recycled wood. Solar panels. Green rooftops. I had once promised her I'd build something like that in Salem. Maybe I still will. The phone buzzes beside me. It's Jordan from the office. I ignore it. Work can wait. I stare at the box for a long moment. My hands itch to open it. But my heart says no. Not yet. Instead, I walk to her bedroom. Everything is exactly as it was. The bed neatly made. The nightstand stacked with books about gardening and philosophy. The reading glasses folded on top. On the dresser sits a framed photo of the two of us at my company's launch party. She's beaming, holding a glass of champagne. I remember that night vividly. She pulled me aside and said, "Don't forget. Success is only real if you can share it without fear." I run a hand along the frame, then pick up the photo. The glass catches the last bit of sunset. And for a second I see my reflection overlapping hers. The silence stretches, deep and calm. I realize how much of my life has been spent trying to prove I was worth keeping. Maybe that's what she wanted me to understand before she left. That I was already enough. Outside, the wind shifts, scattering the chimes again. I sit on the edge of her bed, feeling the weight of everything she gave me. Tomorrow I'll drive back to the city. But tonight, I just let the quiet fill the room. Steady and warm. Like her presence still lingers somewhere in the light. Morning light slid through the curtains and painted thin stripes across the floor. I made the bed the way she used to, folding each corner tight. Then stood in the doorway looking at her room one last time. Every piece of furniture felt like a memory I wasn't ready to move. Still, I knew it was time to go back to San Francisco. Work had been piling up, and my office was starting to sound impatient through emails. I locked up the house, placed the spare key under the pot by the porch, and drove toward the highway. The road wound through low hills and patches of fog. My mind replayed every conversation we ever had, like small flashes of film stitched together out of order. The way she said my name when she was proud, the soft click of her knitting needles at night, the sound of her laugh when I told her about my first big project. Back in the city, the noise hit like a wave. Horns, sirens, construction drills. I parked outside my apartment downtown and sat in the car for a long moment before heading upstairs. The elevator doors closed, and suddenly I was alone with my reflection again. The same suit. The same tired eyes. Success had followed me everywhere. But peace never did. When I walked into my apartment, the silence was different from the silence in Salem. This one felt artificial. Built by design. I made coffee. Scrolled through work messages. And tried to focus on a new contract. But my thoughts drifted back to the wooden box sitting on her kitchen table. I had left it there, thinking it could wait. By the third night, I couldn't stop wondering what she wanted me to know. On Friday, I called Oliver. He sounded unsurprised. I told him I was driving back up. He said he'd meet me at the house. The next day, clouds followed me the whole way north. When I reached Salem, the air smelled like rain again. Oliver was waiting on the porch. Hat pulled low. He handed me the key and said he'd give me privacy. Before leaving, he added quietly, "She meant for you to find peace, not pain. Remember that." Inside, everything was as I left it. Dust had settled on the table, faint but visible in the light. The box sat in the same place. My hands felt heavy when I picked it up. The lid creaked open, the smell of cedar rising with it. Inside was an envelope, sealed and yellowed at the edges. My name written in her careful script for Liam. "When you're ready." I sat down, turning it over once, then tore it open. The paper was thick, folded neatly in thirds. "My dearest Liam, if you're reading this, it means my time has passed, and you're ready to learn what I could never say out loud. You grew up believing your parents left you because they didn't want you. That isn't true. They were forced to leave." I stopped breathing. The words blurred for a moment, then sharpened again. She explained how Daniel, my father, had gone into business with his older brother, Harold Carter, a man I barely knew. Harold borrowed heavily and used my father's name on contracts without his knowledge. When the debts came due, threats followed. They were told that if my parents didn't leave town, my father would face prison and I'd be taken into state custody. They ran to protect me, believing I'd be safer with her. She wrote that she found out later that my father had tried to come back, but Harold intercepted every letter. She never told me because she didn't want me to carry their mistakes. She wanted me to build my own life, not one made of anger. At the bottom of the page, she had added a second note. Smaller handwriting. "You may hear from Harold's family soon. There are things they'll try to claim that are not theirs. Everything I owned, including my shares of Carter & Co., belongs to you. Be careful. My love." The truth is sometimes louder than you think. I read it twice, then a third time. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, confusion, disbelief. The room seemed smaller, the air thick. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on the table. For a long time I just sat there, staring at it, my hands shaking. Eventually, I stepped outside for air. The yard was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the pines. I leaned against the railing, trying to make sense of it all. My parents hadn't abandoned me. They had been trapped, manipulated. My grandmother had carried that secret for 25 years. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. Oliver's car rolled up the drive again. He climbed out, holding a manila folder. "There's one more thing," he said. "She wanted me to give you these documents." He placed the folder in my hands. Inside were property deeds, stock certificates, and a copy of the company's registration papers. My name was listed under hers as beneficiary. I stared at the documents. My company, Carter Co., had been started with her help. I thought her investment was small, a loan she'd saved from teaching. But this said she owned a third of it, and now it was mine. Oliver cleared his throat. "You should also know that Dean Carter Harold's son contacted me last week. He's challenging her will. Claims the assets were meant to stay within his branch of the family. I felt something tighten in my chest. Dean. I'd met him a few times at business events. He was polished, charming, and fake in all the ways that came easy to him. What does he want? I asked. Control, Oliver said simply. He left soon after, promising to call when the paperwork reached probate court. When the sun began to set, I went back inside. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath again. I sat on the floor beside the table, the letter open in front of me. I could almost hear her voice. You can't change what people do, Liam. But you can decide who you'll be because of it. I folded the letter, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and looked around the kitchen one last time. The place that had once been my refuge now felt like the beginning of something else. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood on the porch as darkness settled over the fields. For years I'd built a life from the fragments she gave me, believing that was enough. Now the pieces were shifting again, revealing a truth that refused to stay buried. As I walked to my car, I caught my reflection in the window. The man staring back at me didn't look lost anymore. He looked ready. Monday morning hit like a storm. I was back in San Francisco, standing outside the glass doors of Carter & Co. My name printed across the metal plaque beside them. The reflection staring back at me looked calm, but inside everything churned. I had spent the weekend reading Grandma's letter again and again, memorizing every word. Now, I had to face what came next. Inside the lobby, the air was sharp with the smell of fresh paint and coffee. Employees moved quickly, talking in low voices. My assistant Jordan met me near the elevators. He looked nervous, eyes darting toward the upper floor. Dean's here, he said quietly. He's been in your office since 8. Of course he was. Dean always liked to arrive before anyone else, just to prove he could. When I walked into my office, he was sitting in my chair, legs crossed, flipping through one of the architectural portfolios on my desk. He looked up and smiled like we were old friends. Liam, he said. Finally. I was starting to think you forgot where you worked. I shut the door. What are you doing in my office? He leaned back, still smiling. Relax. I came to talk about the company, and about Grandma's will. I said nothing. Waiting. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the window. The city stretched out behind him, all glass and motion. You know, Uncle Harold built this business from the ground up before your father took his share and ran. And then there's you. You wouldn't even have Carter & Co. without the family name. You mean without my grandmother? I said. He turned, the smile fading just a little. She had her moments of generosity, but you can't seriously believe she meant to hand everything over to you. She was confused at the end. I have my lawyers reviewing her documents. I crossed my arms. I read the documents. Her wishes were clear. Dean's voice sharpened. You think a letter and a few dusty signatures make you a Carter. You're nothing but a charity project. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. You're talking about the woman who raised me. Watch your mouth. He smirked, stepping closer. We'll see what the courts think. He brushed past me and left, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing down the hall. For the next week, the tension in the office grew thick. Dean sent out memos without my approval, rearranged project leads, and whispered to board members. Rumors started to spread that I had falsified company expenses to cover personal investments. It was an old tactic: discredit first, strike second. By Thursday, I received an email from the Corporate Ethics Board requesting an internal audit. My stomach dropped. Dean had moved faster than I thought. That night I stayed late, reviewing documents, cross-checking every transaction. Nothing was out of place. But lies move quicker than truth. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. "This is Grace Miller from the Chronicle," the voice said. "I'm writing a piece on local architecture firms under review. I'd like your comment." I almost hung up. But something in her tone stopped me. Calm. Firm. Not like the vultures who usually called. "You sound too polite to be a reporter," I said. She laughed softly. "That's because I'm not trying to destroy you. Not yet. Anyway, can we meet off the record?" The next morning, we met at a cafe near the Embarcadero. Grace was younger than I expected. Late 20s, maybe. Hair pulled back. Sharp eyes that missed nothing. She ordered black coffee and set a recorder on the table. Then pushed it aside. "Off the record means off," she said. "Tell me why your cousin's feeding the press stories about financial misconduct." "So you've talked to him?" I said. "I've talked to everyone," she replied. "But you're the only one who hasn't said a word. That usually means someone's hiding the truth or trying to protect it. Which one are you?" I stared at my cup. Maybe both. I told her enough to give shape to the story without revealing everything. About the family. The inheritance. The letter. Her expression softened when I mentioned Grandma. "You think he's trying to take the company," she said. "I don't think. I know." She tapped her fingers on the table. "Then let's find proof." Over the next few days, Grace and I went through public records, legal filings, anything linked to Dean or his branch of the family. It didn't take long to find patterns. Fake invoices, shell accounts, quiet transfers to real estate deals in Los Angeles. He was bleeding the company from inside while pointing the finger at me. One night, we met in my office to go through the last batch of files. The city lights shimmered through the window, turning the papers gold and silver. Grace leaned over my desk. Her brow furrowed. "If we can link these transactions to his personal account," she said, "it's over for him." She found it before I did an email trail connecting Dean's assistant to a fake vendor account. I stared at the screen, the proof glowing right in front of us. Relief hit first, then anger. Deep and cold. I picked up my phone. "Oliver needs to see this." Grace placed a hand on my arm. "Wait until morning. Let it sit. If you act now, he'll know you're onto him." I nodded reluctantly. She was right. The next morning, I forwarded everything to Oliver with a single message: "Found what we need. Call me." That afternoon, Dean stormed into my office. Face flushed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I looked up slowly. "Good morning to you too. Don't play stupid. You've been digging where you don't belong." "You mean in my own company?" He slammed his hands on the desk. "You're finished. Liam. You hear me, finished." I stood, keeping my voice calm. "If you're so sure, maybe we should let the court decide." For a moment he said nothing, eyes burning. Then he laughed, short and cold, and walked out. That evening Oliver called. The audit results came back clean for me. Dirty for Dean. Fraud. Embezzlement. Forgery. He was being summoned to a hearing. I sat in my car for a long time after the call ended. The city outside was a blur of lights and motion. Grandma's voice played in my head again. "You can't change what people do, Liam, but you can decide who you'll be because of it." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I wasn't the scared kid waiting by the window anymore. This time, I was ready to fight for what she left me. The rain started again. Soft at first, then steady. I turned on the wipers and drove into the dark. not sure where the road would take me next. But knowing there was no turning back now. The following days blurred into a mix of meetings, legal calls, and headlines. News of the investigation into Dean spread through the local business press faster than I could contain it. Some outlets painted him as a visionary undone by greed. Others called it a classic case of family betrayal. Either way, Carter & Co. was back in the spotlight. And I was the one standing in it. I barely slept. My phone vibrated constantly. Messages from lawyers, board members, and reporters all demanding clarity. Grace texted only once, "He's losing control of the story. Be careful." That was the night I decided I couldn't just defend myself. I had to take back everything my grandmother built. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at the San Francisco County Courthouse. I arrived early, dressed in a charcoal suit that suddenly felt too tight. Oliver met me at the entrance, carrying a thick folder. His expression was calm, almost reassuring. "Everything's in here," he said. "The audit reports, the emails, the bank transfers. It's airtight." Dean arrived 10 minutes later with his lawyer, a man whose smile looked carved from marble. Dean didn't look at me, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. Inside, the courtroom buzzed quietly with reporters and a few company employees who had slipped in out of curiosity. The judge entered. The murmurs stopped, and the proceedings began. Dean's attorney went first, painting him as the victim of a misunderstanding. A few misplaced accounts, clerical errors, confusion over shared assets. Nothing malicious. When my turn came, Oliver stood and laid out the evidence piece by piece. Each document, each email, each transaction formed a chain that pulled Dean tighter into the truth. Then came Grace's statement. She had been subpoenaed after her article exposed the inconsistencies in Dean's public statements. She spoke clearly, her tone steady. The facts matched perfectly with the documents we had found. By the time she stepped down, Dean's lawyer looked pale. When the judge adjourned for deliberation, the room exhaled as one. Dean sat frozen, eyes unfocused, as if the ground beneath him had finally given way. I didn't feel triumph, only a hollow sort of calm. Outside, the air was crisp. Reporters surrounded me the moment I stepped out. Questions flew from every direction. I said nothing, walking straight to my car. Oliver followed, catching up as I reached the door. "It's done," he said quietly. "They'll rule in your favor." I nodded. Maybe now the company can breathe again. That evening, I went back to the office. The building was nearly empty. Just the hum of lights and the low whir of computers left running overnight. I walked the halls, remembering my first day there. The sense of awe I felt standing in a place my grandmother had helped build. Every success I'd had since then carried her fingerprints. In my office, I turned on the lamp and sat behind the desk. The city glowed outside, reflections rippling across the glass. For the first time in months, it felt quiet. I opened the top drawer and pulled out her letter again. The paper had softened from how often I'd handled it. Her words echoed in my head. "Be careful, my love. The truth is sometimes louder than you think." A knock on the door broke the silence. Grace stepped in, holding 2 coffees. "I figured you hadn't eaten," she said. I smiled faintly. "You figured right." She set the cup on my desk and sat across from me. "So, what now?" "Now," I said, "we rebuild." She nodded, studying me for a moment. "You know, most people in your position would have buried that story, pretended none of this happened. I didn't do it for headlines." She leaned back. "No, you did it for her." We sat quietly for a while. watching the fog roll in from the bay. When she left, I stayed by the window long after the lights of her car disappeared. For years, I had believed the only way to survive was to move forward, no matter what it cost. But Grandma had known better. Sometimes you have to stop running before you can truly move on. The following week, the court issued its final ruling. Dean was found guilty of fraud and financial misconduct. He was ordered to forfeit his shares and pay restitution. I thought I would feel satisfaction. But what came instead was a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The name Carter had always been tied to ambition, pride, and loss. Now it carried something heavier. I spent the next few days cleaning house. Dean's allies resigned or were removed. And I brought in new leadership. People who believed in what we once stood for. I renamed the firm Carter Design Group. A nod to the past without being chained to it. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, I drove back to Salem. The fields glowed gold, the air thick with the scent of grass. I parked by the house, the same creak in the porch steps welcoming me like an old song. Inside, the furniture was covered in dust sheets, the air still. I opened the windows, letting in the cool breeze. The house felt smaller than I remembered, but warmer too. I walked to the kitchen table and laid her letter there. Beside a photo of her smiling in her garden, I whispered, "We did it, Grandma." Then I sat in her old chair, listening to the wind move through the trees. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The phone buzzed on the table. A message from Grace. "They're publishing the final piece tomorrow," she wrote. The headline simple. "The man who rebuilt his family's name." I smiled, then turned the phone face down. The world outside could wait. For now, the quiet belonged to me, to her, and to everything we had fought to protect. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, catching the dust that floated in the air. I poured coffee into the same chipped mug Grandma used to keep by the sink. The quiet of the house felt softer now. Not empty anymore, but full of something settled. I took my cup outside to the porch, where the boards groaned under my weight, and looked out at the open field. Mist still clung to the grass, curling and breaking apart in the breeze. For years, this place had been the edge of my world. Now it felt like the start of something else. A few days had passed since the ruling. The papers had run their stories. The phones had stopped ringing. And the chaos had finally gone still. Yet beneath that peace, I could sense something unfinished. Dean hadn't reached out. And part of me wondered if he ever would. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But instinct made me answer. "Liam, it's Dean." The voice was hoarse, quieter than I remembered. He said he wanted to talk. No lawyers, no headlines, just face to face. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met that evening in the parking lot of an old diner off Highway 101, halfway between the city and Salem. When I arrived, the sun was sinking low, turning the asphalt orange. Dean was leaning against a black sedan, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn. He looked older, like the last few weeks had stolen years from him. He didn't speak at first, just nodded toward the diner. We went inside and sat at a booth near the window. The waitress brought 2 coffees without asking, probably sensing the weight in the air. Dean stirred his cup, eyes on the table. "You got what you wanted," he said finally. "Congratulations." I didn't respond. He looked up, his expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. "You think you're better than me because Grandma loved you more. This isn't about love," I said quietly. "It's about what you did." He laughed under his breath. What I did. You think this family wasn't built on lies long before I came along? You think your father was some saint? I leaned forward. Whatever my father did, Grandma tried to fix. You destroyed everything she stood for. He looked out the window, his reflection framed by the fading light. You sound just like her. Always preaching about integrity while judging everyone else. She hid plenty from you. You know, the words hit like a small crack in glass. What do you mean? He turned back, eyes sharp again. Harold wasn't the only one who ruined your parents. Grandma made them leave. She forced them out to protect her reputation. That's not true. He shrugged. Believe what you want. But she made deals with Harold behind your father's back. Ask Oliver. He handled her estate. He'll confirm it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress refilled our cups. The clink of ceramic loud in the silence. If you're lying, I said slowly, you've got nothing left to lose. But if you're telling the truth, why say it now? Because, he said, I wanted you to know before you make the same mistake. You think you're better than this family. But you're still a Carter. You'll end up like the rest of us. Alone. Righteous. And miserable. He stood, tossed a few bills on the table, and walked out. I sat there, staring at the dark surface of my coffee, the reflection shaking slightly from my unsteady hand. The drive back to Salem was a blur of headlights and rain. I kept replaying his words, trying to separate truth from venom. When I got home, I went straight to the desk and called Oliver. He answered on the second ring. I need you to be honest with me, I said. Did Grandma ever make a deal with Harold? There was a pause long enough to make my chest tighten. She did, he said finally. But it wasn't what you think. Tell me. Harold came to her after your parents left. He offered to sell back part of the company in exchange for her silence about the fraud. She agreed. Not to protect herself, but to preserve what was left for you. She never trusted him again. But she knew the truth would destroy what your parents had sacrificed for. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. So she carried that lie for the rest of her life. She carried it to protect you. Oliver said softly. She wanted you to build something new, not drag the old sins along with you. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time. The rain tapped softly against the window. Every story I'd been told about my family twisted into something more complicated. But instead of anger, I felt something else. Acceptance. Maybe. The kind that comes when you stop expecting the past to be simple. The next morning, I drove to the coast. The highway curved along the cliffs, waves breaking against the rocks below. I parked at a small overlook where Grandma used to bring me as a kid. I stood at the edge, the wind cold against my face, and finally spoke aloud. I know now. Grandma, you did what you had to. So did they. So did I. A gull wheeled overhead, crying out into the gray sky. I stayed until the tide turned, the sea swallowing the rocks one by one. When I got back to the car, my phone buzzed again. A message from Grace. Heard about Dean. He's leaving the country. No charges beyond restitution. You okay? I typed back. Yeah. Just needed some air. That evening, I returned to San Francisco. The office lights glowed as I drove past. But I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached the waterfront. The city skyline shimmered on the bay, each window a flicker of someone else's story. I sat on a bench, the air smelling of salt and diesel, and realized something I hadn't before. Revenge hadn't given me peace. Truth hadn't either. What mattered was what came after. The chance to build something clean. Something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of old lies. The wind picked up, tugging at my coat. I looked toward the bridge. its lights stretching into the distance like a promise. For the first time in my life, the future didn't scare me. It felt wide open. Waiting. A week later, the sun came up clear over the bay, and the air smelled new, like rain that never arrived. I woke early and drove to the office before anyone else. The streets were quiet, a rare peace in a city that never really slept. Inside, the building hummed softly, lights flickering on one by one as I walked down the hall. My reflection followed me in the glass walls. Not the man who once lived in anger, but someone lighter, deadier. The name on the front sign had already changed. Carter Design Group. It felt right. The company was no longer about what had been stolen or lost, but what could still be built. I stopped by the model room where teams were working on new sustainable housing projects, the kind Grandma would have loved. I ran my hand along a wooden model of a small coastal community we planned to build near Monterey. Every home designed for light, airflow, and space. Every piece built with care. Later that morning, I met with the board. New faces, new energy. We talked about expansion, partnerships, but mostly about purpose. I told them that our next project wouldn't just be about profit. It would be about giving something back. A foundation to help at-risk youth learn trades in construction, design, and engineering. I wanted to name it after her, the Margaret Foundation. After the meeting, Grace stopped by my office with a folder. The Chronicle wants to do a follow-up, she said. They want to talk about how you turned it all around. I smiled. Let them. But make sure they know it wasn't just me. She lingered for a second. You ever think about what comes next? Liam. Every day. I said. But now it's not about proving anything. It's about peace. She nodded and left, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I watched her go, realizing how much had changed since the day we met in that cafe. Back then, everything felt like survival. Now it felt like living. That evening, I drove north again, this time without hesitation. The sky turned pink over the hills, the road unwinding like a memory I no longer feared. When I reached Salem, the fields were golden, the same light I'd grown up under. I parked in front of the house, grass swaying in the wind, and walked up the steps. The door creaked open, as if it had been waiting. Inside, I carried the photo of Grandma I kept on my desk. I set it on the table beside her old reading chair. Then I took a deep breath and spoke softly. We made it. Grandma, you were right. The truth was louder than I thought. But it didn't break me. It set me free. I sat there for a long while, the quiet filling the room. Somewhere outside, the sound of crickets rose with the dusk. I remembered the first night she brought me here. A scared kid who thought the world had ended. She had told me that pain was just another kind of beginning. I hadn't understood it then. Now I did. Before leaving, I walked out to the small garden behind the house. The flowers had grown wild, yellow and white against the fading light. I knelt and brushed the soil with my hand, feeling the warmth still trapped from the sun. I planted a small wooden plaque in the ground beside the old roses. It read simply, "For Margaret, Builder of Hearts." As I stood, a breeze swept through the yard, rattling the wind chimes, the same sound that used to echo through the kitchen late at night. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by it. I felt accompanied. Back in the city, I found myself walking along the waterfront most evenings. Sometimes Grace joined me. Sometimes I went alone. One night, she asked what I'd do if my parents ever tried to contact me. I thought about it for a long moment. I'd listen. I said, not because they deserve it, but because I'm done carrying the past like a weapon. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Months passed, and the foundation took shape. The first group of apprentices arrived that spring. Kids who reminded me of the boy I used to be. We built simple things at first. Benches, garden sheds, small community projects. But their faces lit up every time something they built stood on its own. It felt like watching new roots take hold. One afternoon, as I stood watching them work, Oliver walked over, leaning on his cane. "You know, Margaret would be proud of this," he said. I smiled. "I hope so." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "You've done more than rebuild her legacy, Liam. You've rewritten it." I didn't know what to say, so I just shook his hand. That evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind in the workshop. The air smelled of sawdust and oil. I picked up a piece of unfinished wood, the kind my uncle used to work with, and carved the first letter of my grandmother's name. The blade moved steady in my hand. Outside, the sky turned deep blue, the last light fading from the windows. I realized that the story wasn't about revenge after all. It was about rebuilding, about learning that justice isn't only in what you win but in what you create from the ruins. When I finally stepped outside, the night was clear and wide. The bay shimmered in the distance, lights from the city reflecting off the water. I thought about everything that had led me here. Every loss, every choice, every truth uncovered. I walked down to the shoreline, shoes sinking slightly into the sand, and let the water brush against my feet. The waves came in slow, steady, and for the first time in my life, I didn't fight them. I just let them come. If you've stayed with me this far, maybe you understand what I didn't for a long time. That sometimes life breaks you just to see what you'll build afterward. And maybe, just maybe, the second version of your story is stronger than the first. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me your thoughts. Or subscribe if you want to walk through more stories like this one. Every story we rebuild together makes the next one a little stronger.